I grew up thinking my family was simple. My dad, Greg, was the kind of man everyone respected, charming, successful, always smiling in pictures. My mom, Linda, was quiet, patient, and endlessly accommodating, the glue holding everything together. I loved them both, without question. But somewhere in the background, there was tension I couldn't name. It was in the way Mom would stiffen when Dad's phone rang, in the way he sometimes disappeared for hours without explanation, and in the way whispered voices drifted through the hallway late at night. I ignored it because I wanted my family to be perfect. I wanted to believe in the story we told everyone else. When I was 13, I started noticing things more clearly. Dad's phone would light up constantly, and he would leave the room to take calls. I remember walking past his study once and seeing a woman's name flash across the screen, something unfamiliar. I asked about it later, and Dad laughed it off, said it was a work contact. Mom didn't question it. I thought I was imagining things. Still, the unease stayed, lurking in corners. Every vacation, every holiday, there was a subtle tension. A crack in the perfect facade that I couldn't name, couldn't explain. High school only sharpened my perception. I'd hear hushed phone conversations, notice small inconsistencies in Dad's stories about work trips, and see Mom smile in ways that didn't reach her eyes. She was always gracious, polite, supportive, but something behind that veneer felt carefully measured. I chalked it up to teenage paranoia, to overactive imagination, because in my house, admitting suspicion felt wrong. Loyalty to family was a rule drilled into me, and I obeyed without question. I was dutiful, obedient, patient, believing the adults in my life had reasons I couldn't understand. Then came the first rumor. I overheard classmates whispering about someone at school whose parent was having an affair. I didn't think much of it at first, until a friend mentioned Dad's name. My stomach dropped. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was impossible. My dad loved Mom, right? He always seemed happy at home. I told myself that love was enough, that nothing I'd seen could contradict the years of good memories I had. But doubt had already taken root. It wasn't until I was 16 that I accidentally discovered concrete proof. I was doing a school project and needed to print something, so I borrowed Dad's laptop while he was out. A folder caught my eye labeled with a name I didn't recognize. Curiosity got the better of me. Inside were photos of a woman I didn't know. But it wasn't just photos. There were ultrasound images, notes about appointments, dates, and baby names. My hands froze. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, unwilling to accept the reality staring back at me. My dad had gotten someone pregnant. Twice, I felt my world fracture in slow motion. How could this be true? How could he do this to Mom, to us? The betrayal felt personal, not just between the adults involved. I was angry, confused, terrified. I closed the laptop and tried to act normal, but my thoughts were loud, relentless. I replayed every missed dinner, every suspicious call, every time Dad disappeared. Each memory now seemed stained with evidence I had ignored. I felt foolish for not seeing it sooner. The next few days were unbearable. I watched Dad move through the house, unaware that I knew. I felt my anger simmer beneath every word he spoke, every casual laugh. Mom seemed to notice something, but she didn't say anything. She made the same polite conversation, the same gentle smiles. But there was a tension I hadn't fully appreciated before. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but now it hit me like a hammer every time I saw her. One evening, I confronted my friend about what they'd said. They reiterated what they had heard, and suddenly the rumors weren't rumors anymore. They had a foundation. I felt sick thinking about Mom. She had always seemed so in control, so unshakable. How could she know about this and stay silent? The thought was both terrifying and confusing. I couldn't reconcile the woman who comforted me after scraped knees with someone who might have been tolerating her husband's infidelity for years. I tried to find more evidence before approaching anyone. Desperate to be sure before saying anything aloud, I searched through old receipts, noticed bank transfers, dates that didn't align with Dad's work trips. The pieces fit together in a way that was undeniable. My hands shook as I connected the dots. The weight of knowing was unbearable. I felt betrayed, powerless, and trapped. I wanted to scream, to confront, to run away. But I was too young, too dependent, too loyal to act rashly. Finally, I confronted Dad. I waited until he was alone in the study, and my voice trembled as I asked him to explain. He froze, guilt written across his face, eyes darting away. For a moment, I thought he might deny it. But then came the half-hearted admission, vague and defensive. He said it was complicated, that mistakes were made, that he didn't want to hurt anyone. My chest burned with anger. How could he admit it so lightly? Didn't he understand the damage? Didn't he understand how it felt to know he had children out there being raised while we pretended everything was normal? I left the study shaking, my stomach a knot of disbelief and rage. That night, I lay awake thinking about Mom. She must have known. She had to have. How else could she smile at Dad after all those suspicious absences? How else could she stay composed during family dinners? I hated the thought, hated myself for even considering it. But deep down, I knew it was true. My safe, orderly world had collapsed, leaving me with a truth I didn't know how to handle. I spent the next few days in quiet observation, noting every interaction between my parents. Dad avoided my gaze, careful, measured. Mom was calm to calm. I couldn't fathom how she carried herself, how she navigated a house built on lies without breaking down. I felt a mix of admiration and disgust, anger and fear. The knowledge gnawed at me, pulling me apart piece by piece. By the end of that week, I realized something fundamental. My family was not what it seemed. Everything I had believed about loyalty, love, and honesty had been upended. I was caught between wanting to expose the truth and protecting the fragile facade that held the family together. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that nothing would ever feel safe again. The seeds of betrayal had been planted, and I was trapped in the shadow of the secret my parents had carried for years. From that moment, every glance, every conversation, every quiet corner of my home carried weight. I felt like a detective and a hostage at once. And in the pit of my stomach, I knew the storm was only beginning. The truth had been uncovered, but the reckoning, emotional, inevitable, devastating, had yet to arrive. The confrontation with my dad came sooner than I expected. I cornered him in the garage while he was tinkering with his motorcycle, pretending to focus, pretending not to notice me. My hands were shaking, heart hammering, throat tight, but I forced the words out. "Dad, what?" I asked. Not a casual question, not something I could shrug off. The weight behind it pressed down on both of us. His hands froze mid-motion, wrench hovering in the air. He looked at me with those same eyes I had trusted my whole life, eyes now flickering with guilt and fear. He tried to brush it off at first, talking around the question like it was complicated math rather than a betrayal of trust. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said, voice low. "It's complicated." I felt rage like fire searing through me. Complicated. Children were involved, another woman, 2 pregnancies. And he thought calling it complicated would erase everything. I swallowed hard, fighting back tears and anger simultaneously. Complicated doesn't begin to cover it. "Dad, you have no idea how much you've destroyed," I said, voice trembling but sharp. He flinched as if my words could physically strike him, and that moment, brief as it was, gave me a sense of power I hadn't felt before. I didn't know yet about Mom knowing. I wanted answers. The raw, unfiltered truth from the source. Not whispers or rumors. But something in his posture, the way he avoided my gaze, hinted that he wasn't being fully honest. I pressed harder, asking about the women, the pregnancies, the children he'd fathered outside our family. His shoulders sagged, guilt pressing down like a heavy weight. "You're right," he said finally. "I messed up. But you don't understand." He stopped, realizing any excuse would sound hollow. I stared at him, furious. "Explain it. All of it. Now." He stumbled over words, admitting first the existence of one child, then the second. The dates, the complications. My head spun, stomach twisting. How had this been hidden from me? From Mom, from everyone. The revelation was like stepping into ice-cold water. My breath caught, and I felt dizzy, nauseous. And yet, beneath the shock, beneath the hurt, was a strange, flickering clarity. This was real. There was no denying it. And that clarity was almost comforting in its brutal honesty. Then came the part I wasn't ready for. I asked about Mom what she knew. His face went pale, hands tightening into fists. He avoided my eyes. "She knows," he said finally, almost in a whisper. My heart stopped. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. "What do you mean she knows?" I asked, my voice brittle, shaking with disbelief. He muttered something about her finding out early and choosing to stay silent for the sake of the family. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest, a mixture of anger, confusion, and betrayal so deep it left me momentarily paralyzed. I left the garage, my mind spinning. I needed to confront Mom. I needed to understand how she could have stayed in the dark about something so devastating, so personal, so cruel. Later that evening, when the house was quiet, I found her in the kitchen, washing dishes with her back to me. I approached cautiously, unsure if I wanted confrontation or explanation or both. My stomach churned. "Mom?" I said softly. She didn't turn. I repeated my question, firmer this time, voice cracking with emotion. "Mom, did you know about Dad, about the pregnancies?" She paused, hands stilling in the soapy water. She turned slowly, face composed but eyes unreadable. There was no immediate flinch, no gasp, no denial. Instead, she nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly. My chest felt hollow. I couldn't reconcile the woman who had comforted me after scraped knees, the woman I thought was honest and steadfast, with someone who had carried this knowledge silently, letting the deception continue. "How? Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, barely a whisper. Mom sighed, a sound heavy with years of concealed emotion. "I wanted to protect you," she said simply. "And him, and the family. I thought I could manage it, control it, keep it from destroying everything." Her calmness felt like a knife twisting in my gut. She spoke with moral certainty, yet the impact of her silence was nothing short of catastrophic. My anger surged, hot and suffocating. "Protect me," I shouted, voice shaking. "Protect me by letting him lie, by letting everything happen behind my back, by pretending none of this existed." She didn't shrink away. She didn't try to soften the words. She just nodded again, as if I was overreacting. "I thought it was the right thing," she said. "It was my choice. I thought I could survive it, and so could you." I stared at her, trying to measure her calm, to find the thread that made sense of it, and found nothing. Only betrayal, only shattered illusions. The mother I had revered was human, fallible, and complicit, and I had loved her all the same. The room felt suffocating, air thick with unspoken history and years of hidden truths. I tried to articulate the whirlwind inside, disappointment, fury, heartbreak, disbelief, but words failed. I was screaming silently in my mind. Mom's calm composure enraged me more than Dad's guilt had. At least he had been caught in the act. She had been watching, aware, and had chosen silence. That choice, deliberate and maintained over years, was impossible to forgive in that moment. As I walked away from the kitchen that night, every step felt weighted. I felt like I had crossed into a new reality where nothing was as it seemed. My family had secrets, deceit, and unspoken agreements that left me unmoored. I knew life would never be the same again. My anger was raw and personal, but beneath it lay a creeping sadness. A mourning for the version of my family I had believed in, the one that never existed. Lying in my room that night, I thought about the pregnancies, about the children I didn't know, about the choices my parents had made. How could they all fit into the narrative of our perfect family? How could anyone maintain that illusion while such profound betrayal existed beneath the surface? I felt powerless, small, angry, yet also strangely aware that this was a moment of reckoning, not just for them, but for me. I could no longer pretend. I could no longer trust without proof. By the end of the night, I had formed a plan, though I didn't yet know the full shape of it. I needed to understand the full scope of what had happened, who was involved, and what my parents had been willing to endure and hide for years. I knew the path forward would be painful, messy, and possibly irreversible. But the truth had been revealed. The betrayal was laid bare, and the questions I now carried could no longer be ignored. I clenched my fists, staring at the ceiling, letting the rage, the confusion, and the disbelief settle into something harder: determination. I would confront them both together. I would demand the truth, unvarnished and complete. I would not flinch, not back down, and I would not allow them to continue hiding behind each other or behind me. The storm had arrived, and I was no longer willing to stay in the eye, quietly watching while my family crumbled behind smiles and polite conversations. It was time to force the reckoning. The days that followed felt like walking through a house full of ghosts. I couldn't look at Dad without remembering the proof I had found, the ultrasound images, the folder of documents I had stumbled across. Every conversation with him was laced with tension. I noticed how he avoided my gaze, how his voice wavered when he spoke, and how he moved with a stiffness I had never seen before. My anger was a living thing, crawling under my skin, pushing me to confront him again. But now I realized it wasn't just him I needed to face. It was Mom too. Mom's presence was almost surreal. She moved through the house with the same grace and calm that had always comforted me, but now it felt like a performance. Every smile seemed measured, every word carefully chosen. I watched her silently, noting the faintest flinch when Dad mentioned work trips or social events. There was guilt there, yes, but also a steeliness I didn't recognize. She had endured this knowledge for years and carried it without breaking down, or maybe she had broken down quietly. behind closed doors. I couldn't tell. That ambiguity made my anger sharper. I found myself replaying conversations in my head. Every interaction between my parents now filtered through the lens of betrayal. Dad's excuses, his half-truths, the way he had tried to soften admissions with complicated, I could see through all of it. Mom's silence, her composed demeanor, her refusal to confront me with the truth sooner, it all felt like collusion. And I hated myself for the parts of me that still wanted to protect them. Still wanted to believe there was some version of my family that wasn't fractured. The twins, the other children, the women involved, they were specters in my mind. I thought about the lives that had been intersecting with ours in secrecy, the casual way decisions had been made about futures, about families, about love and responsibility. The enormity of it crushed me. I couldn't even process the fact that Dad had fathered children outside our home twice, that Mom had known and allowed it to continue. It wasn't just betrayal, it was a quiet, persistent violence, and I felt powerless to stop it. I reached my breaking point during dinner one evening. The twins were screaming, the table cluttered, and my parents were speaking in polite tones that grated on my nerves. I couldn't keep pretending. I slammed my hand against the table, the sound sharp enough to make everyone jump. "I can't do this anymore," I shouted, voice raw with frustration and pain. Both of them froze. My heart raced, adrenaline pumping, but for the first time, I felt like I was speaking with authority. They had no choice but to listen. I laid out everything I had discovered. Every detail of Dad's actions, every inconsistency, every lie. I looked at Mom, accusing, demanding, and even though she didn't flinch, I could see the flicker of unease in her eyes. She tried to speak, to explain, but I cut her off. I wanted the raw truth, not the polished version. I demanded to know why she had kept this from me, why she had allowed Dad's behavior to continue unchecked. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken shame and fear. Dad's face turned red, hands gripping his chair as if he could physically hold himself together. He stammered, trying to find excuses, saying he hadn't known how to handle it, that he was scared of breaking the family apart. I didn't care about fear. I didn't care about explanations. I wanted accountability. I wanted acknowledgement that what he had done, what they had allowed, was wrong. The silence that followed was heavy, almost tangible. They were cornered, forced to face the consequences of years of deception. Mom finally spoke, voice steady but low. She admitted that she had known about both pregnancies, that she had chosen silence for the sake of appearances, for the sake of keeping us together. The confession hit me like a physical blow. I staggered back, feeling dizzy, betrayed, furious, and utterly heartbroken all at once. How could she have made that choice? How could she have placed loyalty to the illusion of a family above honesty, above me? I wanted to scream, to hit something, to shake her until she felt the betrayal as I did. I realized then that my anger was not just for myself or for the deception. It was for all the stolen moments, the trust violated, the years of pretending. I had been complicit in silence too, willing to believe the stories I was told because I wanted to preserve my image of home. Now, knowing the truth, that silence was no longer an option, I had to act, to assert myself, to confront both of them with the reality they had hidden so carefully. In the days that followed, I began to gather evidence, not for blackmail or revenge, but to protect myself and establish clarity. I documented conversations, collected records, pieced together. The process was exhausting, emotionally draining, but empowering in a way I hadn't anticipated. I realized that knowledge gave me leverage not to punish, but to demand honesty and accountability. It was the first step toward reclaiming power in a house that had been built on secrets and lies. Every interaction with them became a test of patience and resolve. Dad tried to charm, to deflect, to apologize without admitting full responsibility. Mom tried to soothe, to calm, to rationalize her silence as protection, but I didn't budge. Each attempt to placate me was met with firm questions, pointed observations, and unflinching scrutiny. I felt the balance of power shifting subtly. For the first time, I was no longer a passive observer in my own family drama. I had stepped into the center of it, demanding recognition of truth, and nothing they could say or do would allow me to shrink back. One night, lying in bed, I replayed every memory of my childhood through the lens of this new knowledge. Every whispered conversation, every late-night absence, every moment of tension that I had rationalized suddenly made sense. And with that clarity came a decision. I would confront them fully, together. I would demand answers, explanations, and most importantly, accountability. I would not let them hide behind each other or behind their own carefully constructed narratives. It was time to force a reckoning, to make the consequences of their choices impossible to ignore. And as I drifted to a restless sleep, a mixture of anger, sorrow, and determination swirling through me, I knew one thing clearly: this family would never be the same. And neither would I. The truth had erupted into the open, and now it was my responsibility to navigate the aftermath, to claim my own voice, and to confront the parents who had lied to me for so long. The storm had arrived, and I would meet it head. The day I decided to confront them together, the air in the house felt heavier than ever. I told Dad and Mom to meet me in the living room after dinner, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to mask the whirlwind inside me. The twins were asleep, and the house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I could see the tension in Dad's shoulders, the careful composure Mom maintained, and I felt a mix of fear, anticipation, and a strange kind of empowerment. This was the moment I stopped being a passive witness and demanded accountability. Dad arrived first, pretending casualness that didn't fool me for a second. His hands were shaking slightly, lips pressed into a thin line. Mom followed shortly after, walking with her usual poise, but I could see the subtle tremor in her jaw, the way her hands clutched her purse strap. I felt my own pulse hammering in my ears as I stood facing them. I took a deep breath and started with what I knew, laying it out clearly and deliberately. I told them I knew about the pregnancies, about the children, and about Mom's silence. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I simply spoke the truth, letting the weight of it hang between us. Dad's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Mom's eyes remained steady, but I could see the flicker of discomfort that betrayed her calm. I watched them squirm under the gaze of the truth I wielded, and I felt a surge of satisfaction. Not vindictive, but just, they couldn't hide anymore. They couldn't soften or spin or charm their way out of the reckoning, I demanded. I felt my own power solidify, anchored in clarity and moral certainty. I pressed on, describing how their actions had affected me, how betrayal had torn at my trust and reshaped my childhood and adolescence. I spoke of the fear, the confusion, the helplessness I had felt discovering the truth. I watched their reactions carefully, Dad's shoulders slumping, Mom's lips pressing together, but I didn't soften. This was not the time for reconciliation. This was the time for accountability, and I wasn't going to back down. Mom finally spoke, her voice low but firm. She admitted that she had known about both pregnancies, that she had chosen silence to maintain the family's facade. I felt a wave of anger crash over me. You chose appearances over honesty, over me, I shouted, words sharp but measured. She didn't flinch, only nodded slightly. Her composure, which once comforted me, now felt like betrayal magnified. She had let deception fester under her careful management, and I would no longer stand for it. Dad tried to interject, tried to explain that he had made mistakes, and that fear had guided his choices. I cut him off. Fear doesn't excuse betrayal. Silence doesn't absolve participation. I looked at both of them, voice steady despite the tremor of emotion, and told them that the time for excuses was over. The decisions they had made had consequences, and I would not allow them to hide behind half-truths or comforted lies any longer. The weight of the room pressed in, but I stood firm. Anchored by years of suppressed anger and heartbreak finally given voice, they started arguing between themselves, voices rising, blame ricocheting across the room. But I stayed silent, watching, observing, letting their own discomfort underscore the gravity of their choices. I realized that part of the power I held came from simply refusing to participate in their denial. I wasn't there to mediate, to console, or to placate. I was there to ensure that the reality of their actions could no longer be ignored. My anger, disappointment, and demand for accountability were unassailable. As the argument subsided, I addressed the children born outside our family, the pregnancies they had hidden, the lives they had created in secret. I demanded acknowledgement, small but real recognition that these children existed and deserved truth, however complicated it might be. I felt my parents shift uncomfortably under the weight of moral responsibility they had evaded for so long. The room, once tense with anticipation, now pulsed with the discomfort of accountability, the sort of justice that doesn't come with applause but is deeply satisfying nonetheless. After the confrontation, I felt a release, an emotional exhale that I hadn't known I needed. I wasn't happy. I wasn't fully healed, but I was validated. They had no room left to manipulate the narrative. They had no power over my perception of the truth anymore. And for the first time, I felt a sense of clarity about my place in the family, about my own boundaries, and about the principles I refused to compromise. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Dad was quieter, his charm dampened by the realization that deceit had tangible consequences. Mom, too, seemed to carry a new weight, her careful management replaced with tension and cautiousness. I maintained my distance, observing, engaging only on terms that respected my sense of justice and moral clarity. Each interaction became a test of honesty, of accountability, and of recognition for the boundaries I had drawn. The confrontation didn't resolve everything. It didn't erase the betrayal or undo the pain, but it established a new reality. I no longer had to navigate the house with suspicion gnawing at my chest. I no longer had to pretend ignorance. My parents had been forced to reckon with the truth, and in that reckoning, I reclaimed a piece of power that had been denied to me for years. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking acknowledgement. And acknowledgement had been granted through the weight of unspoken truths now finally confronted. As I went to bed that night, listening to the quiet hum of the house, I felt something rare, a sense of agency. I had faced them both, spoken my truth, and demanded accountability. I had navigated betrayal and emerged with a clearer understanding of my own moral boundaries. The road ahead was uncertain, messy, and fraught with difficult conversations. But I was no longer a passive participant in my family's secrets. I was active, engaged, and, above all, unwilling to let deception continue unchecked. For the first time, I felt ready to witness the aftermath, to hold my parents accountable without fear, and to protect myself from the fallout of years of hidden truths. The confrontation had not been easy, and it would not be the last emotional challenge I faced. But it was the first step toward reclaiming clarity, integrity, and the moral balance that had been stolen from me. And as I lay there, heart still pounding, I realized that true power isn't in retaliation, it's in facing the truth and standing firm, no matter how uncomfortable or painful that truth may be. Time passed, and the house began to feel different, not lighter. Exactly, but clearer. The lies and hidden pregnancies still existed, but they were no longer a shadow looming over me. I watched my parents navigate the aftermath of the confrontation with quiet tension. Dad moved carefully, his charm dampened by accountability, forced to acknowledge the consequences of his actions. Mom's composure had shifted to the steeliness was still there, but now it carried a weight of recognition, an unspoken acknowledgement that silence had its price. I noticed subtle changes in myself as well. I no longer flinched at whispered phone calls or hurried conversations. I observed my parents' interactions, noting every nuance without the old anxiety that had once gripped me. I felt grounded in a way I hadn't before, anchored by the knowledge that I could face truth without crumbling. My anger still lingered, but it had transformed into clarity. I knew who I was, what I valued, and the boundaries I would never allow to be crossed again. The children involved in Dad's secret lives remained a presence I had to reckon with, even from a distance. I didn't seek them out, but I observed from the edges, aware that they existed, that they were affected, and that my parents' choices had consequences beyond our family. This awareness shaped how I approached my own family, how I held the line for honesty, respect, and integrity. I realized that part of my role in this fractured family was to ensure that deceit didn't propagate, that lessons were learned, even if forgiveness was not immediate. Dad's attempts at reconciliation were careful, deliberate, but I noticed they were tinged with discomfort and humility. He could no longer operate under the assumption that charm or deflection would protect him. Mom, too, adjusted her expectations, engaging with me and each other in a way that acknowledged the fracture in our family without pretending it didn't exist. I felt a strange, bittersweet relief watching them adapt, recognizing that accountability had reshaped the household dynamics fundamentally. Socially, I became more guarded. Friends who had known parts of the story reached out, offering sympathy and advice. Some urged forgiveness. Others validated my anger. I realized that boundaries weren't just about controlling the home. They were about protecting my mental and emotional space from intrusion. I stopped over-explaining, stopped softening my words to keep others comfortable. I found a quiet satisfaction in asserting myself, in being unapologetically aligned with my values. Mom and I had moments of awkward, tentative honesty. She admitted that staying silent had been her way of coping, of maintaining the family she had built. I didn't fully forgive her, not yet, but I understood in a way that allowed me to interact without simmering rage. That understanding didn't erase the betrayal, but it gave me a framework for moving forward. I could love my parents without excusing their choices. A realization that felt liberating and empowering. Dad's presence remained complicated. I interacted with him cautiously, testing his honesty, gauging his reactions, and measuring the sincerity of his words. He worked to rebuild trust incrementally, but but I maintained the awareness that some lines had been crossed and some consequences were permanent. Observing him navigate these limitations reinforced my understanding that accountability is an ongoing process, not a single moment of confession. The household atmosphere slowly stabilized. I watched my parents handle their guilt and shame with varying degrees of success. They argued, yes, but now the arguments were grounded in reality rather than secrecy. There was tension, but it was tangible, navigable, and ultimately honest. The twins, our children, continued to grow, and I held them close, committed to fostering an environment where deception and betrayal were not normalized. They became my anchor, the reminder that protecting integrity and nurturing trust was not abstract but vital. Reflection became a daily practice. I considered morality, forgiveness, and the complexity of human relationships. I recognized that people often act out of fear, habit, or misplaced loyalty, and that understanding motivation did not equate to condoning behavior. I held space for empathy while maintaining clear moral boundaries. This dual awareness gave me a sense of power, a tool to navigate a family fractured by hidden truths without losing myself to resentment. I also considered the long-term impact of the revelations on myself. I realized I had grown stronger, more assertive, more able to demand accountability without collapsing under the weight of anger or grief. I no longer feared conflict in the same way. I had seen the consequences of deception firsthand and had experienced the liberation of confronting it directly. That lesson, painful as it was, became a cornerstone of my identity. One afternoon, I found an old receipt tucked into a drawer, something related to one of Dad's secret expenses. I stared at it for a moment, letting old anger rise, then smiled faintly. I realized that I had stepped out of the shadow of their deception. The receipt, once a symbol of betrayal, now represented clarity. I had witnessed lies, confronted them, and lived to assert my own moral framework. The past could not be undone, but I had reclaimed my narrative. The story doesn't end neatly. Dad and Mom remain human, flawed, and bound by choices that can never be erased. But I no longer carry their secrets as my own. I have drawn lines that will not be crossed, demanded honesty that cannot be ignored, and learned that self-respect sometimes requires confrontation, discomfort, and unwavering moral clarity. The reckoning I forced was not about punishment, it was about truth, accountability, and reclaiming agency. Sitting quietly now, reflecting on all that has happened, I understand that justice isn't always dramatic. It isn't always public. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's the internal shift, the reclamation of voice, and the refusal to tolerate harm as a default. I have gained that quiet, steady justice. I have seen betrayal, faced it, and asserted my own boundaries without compromise. And in that space, I have found clarity, resilience, and the beginning of peace.